Hi, Lenny.
Hi, Nancy.
Welcome to episode 35 of the Front Porch Book Club.
The Front Porch Book Club is a podcast that meets twice a month.
We like to dig deep into the relationship between characters and the worlds they live in.
Grab your book and iced tea and join us on the front porch.
Well, Lenny, this month we're talking about Hidden Valley Road by Robert Kolker. I have to say, I really enjoyed this book, and I cannot wait to talk with you about it.
I think we're going to have a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
And it really was a great book. Just to give a little quick quip about it, this is a true story. And there's a family of 12 children. They were a baby boomer family, and the children were born between 1945 and the youngest one was 1965. So the father's a military career man. The mom is stay-at-home mom, very typical for that time. But by the mid-70s, 6 of the boys have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And so this is a story about the devastation of the disease of schizophrenia on the family, but then also how the family has helped researchers understand schizophrenia. There's quite a bit on pharmacology and the therapeutic models, different therapeutic models and how that developed over the decades. At the very end, of course, because of the research and the tracking, we actually get to hear some interesting information about the grandchildren because now they are being tested and we have so much more information about DNA. So loved the book, loved all the different facets of the story. It's a great way, I think, to learn about schizophrenia because you're doing it through the people that live there, and they're real people with a real life and real experiences with how this is developed, when the onset was, and also that although they all have schizophrenia, they all have differences in the way that it manifests.
Yeah, I thought this book was really riveting. And I wondered for you if some of the pharmacology and some of the research you were already well aware of, or was some of this new information for you?
Yeah, some of it was like, oh, I'd forgotten about that. That's true. Especially there were some parts that was like, oh, yes, I remember that, like blaming the mom.
Yeah.
Some of the words and some of the theories, yes, I remembered, but not as in depth as this author took. Just those early concepts. What was going on? Where were they looking at? Nature versus nurture. Of course, all of the diseases were looked at through this lens. So he takes it pretty deep in the area of what was going on with the research, but that helped you to understand the mother and the family's journey of this is where people can help us, but they're running blind on a lot of incidences too.
Right.
And we don't have the support that we have nowadays. So it kind of married and went back and forth between a real good understanding of what was happening in research and what people were thinking about schizophrenia. And then, okay, well, how is this affecting this family with these boys that are developing schizophrenia as young adults or late teens? And then how is the family coping with this? Mm-hmm. So very interesting story. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on it, Nancy.
Maybe not surprisingly, I really did love the research angle also, and how he focused on certain researchers and their work and how there were dead ends in some areas of research. Some areas of research went on for decades, and it really wasn't until after decades and they looked at the evidence, they said, you know, maybe what we thought was common sense actually isn't common sense if people are not having positive results to some of these therapies we just thought were the way to treat the disease. You know, there's so much pharmacology around this. Some of the drugs I recognized, others I didn't, from just the social sciences research that I've done that have been related to behavioral health systems of care. But for you, probably some of the drugs were very well known.
Mhm. There has been a huge explosion in advancements in pharmacology, which has very much helped people
Yeah.
to live longer than these poor boys. A lot of them passed away early because of the ravage of the drugs on their system.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's an appreciation now that schizophrenia, you're treating the symptoms of it. So where one person might be more catatonic, or somebody else might be more depressed, or someone else might be more up and down, that it's not like, oh, the person has schizophrenia, this is the drug that we give them. There's advancements all over the mental health field to help come up with the right blend of medicines for people. Certainly since a couple of decades before, I think we're now to the place as a field that, yes, pharmacology is an important part of treating schizophrenia, but also therapy. And you see that evolution over the decades of what do we do with these people? Oh, we put them in the hospital versus, oh, no, no, no. That's a part of it, right? We know that there's things that are misfiring, things that are not acting as they could be in the body. But then we have what's really beautiful about this book is when therapy starts. And one of the daughters starts going to a therapist. It's not that they're just going to the psychiatrist, who is the medical doctor for the drugs. Now we've got the talk therapy part. And then that kind of revolutionizes some of the people in the family's thinking about, okay, there's this other group out here that we can bring in to help support people who have schizophrenia. And now together, this is where you're making the biggest bang for the buck. There are psychiatrists that, as they are providing the meds, they're saying, we want you in therapy. And it can be once a month, it can be weekly, it could be 2 times a month, but that there's someone else a part of the mental health aspect instead of just med management.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what schizophrenia is for people who aren't familiar with that disease. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. It's a chronic brain disorder. And as you see in the Six Brothers, delusions, hallucinations, sometimes disoriented speech, trouble thinking, lack of motivation. Catatonia, I think, is kind of where the one boy was going,
Mm-hmm.
but it kind of manifests itself differently. And even with a couple of the boys, they kind of kept going back to psychiatrists and getting, oh, maybe this is schizoaffective disorder, which is a personality disorder, which is not a part of this classification at all.
Yeah.
Although most people think, oh, that person has schizophrenia, they're talking to themselves. It's a little bit more complicated than that. And that's where you really need a good lens on people. Therapists help with that. Obviously, psychiatrists help with that. Family members help with that. It's fairly evenly distributed among men and women, and men typically have an earlier onset, and about 1% of the population has schizophrenia.
For some reason, I thought that men had a higher preponderance of schizophrenia than women. So that was really interesting for me to understand. And it was just happenstance that the two daughters, neither of them were diagnosed with it, and that the 6 of the 12 children were all boys.
For a male, yeah. It's interesting where people are now with schizophrenia. And there are some fallacies I think people have about the disease and about maybe being friends or having someone in the family that suffers with this. And certainly what the experiences of this family, as we talk about the different people and the personalities, this is a family for that time and how they were coping with it during that time. Now in the year 2020s, people do cope with this differently. There's obviously a lot more information about it. And I think there's less false information about it as well.
Mm-hmm.
Of all of the interesting people in the story, where should we start?
I think we have to start with Mimi.
Okay, we could start with Mimi, the mama.
She was such an interesting woman. In some ways, she was the core of the story. She's the mother of the 12 children. Can you imagine?
No.
And then 6 of them are diagnosed with schizophrenia. One of the things I really appreciated about Kolker's writing is that he wrote clear-eyed about the strengths and weaknesses of everyone in this book. You can tell he really did his research. He asked really hard questions. You see people with all their flaws and all of their strengths as well. And then he also is very clear about her style of interacting with others, especially as the boys are getting older. She has a bitter edge to her. When her boys were first being diagnosed with schizophrenia, what they were telling her is she was the reason. There was even a name, schizophrenetogenic mother.
Nancy, I do remember this.
Do you?
Yes, I remember decades ago that there was a big movement in mental health to find out what's wrong with these children. And it wasn't just schizophrenia, it was a lot of mental health disorders,
Yeah.
whether it was ADHD, autism. Again, the nature versus nurture. Why did this happen? Was it something in the home? Is it the latchkey kid? And all of the researchers having their own angles and trying to find out more information on this. So not only was it schizophrenia, it was a lot of mental health disorders. And because of the judgment that she had, then she didn't share what she was going through. And this became a very isolating incident for her.
Yes.
Because, oh, people are looking at me. I did something wrong. This is my fault. I parented these children with a lot of love. I did the best that I could. Am I to blame? That kind of tears you away from the community. When she needed people the most, she put on a happy face, went to church, had her involvements in different things, and didn't really reach out then.
Yeah, and really downplayed what her sons were going through, of course. Oh, it's not that bad. Tried to normalize it. Certainly delayed getting them treatment for as long as she possibly could, because to go to the local psychiatric hospital would have been devastating to the family's reputation in the community. There was even more stigma then than there is now, I think.
Well, yeah, because you're getting blamed.
Well, exactly.
There's something wrong with their family. Do you really want him working here? Because there's something wrong over there.
And I thought it was interesting. Of course, it's the mother who ends up being the one blamed. And when I read Kolker's description of the schizophrenic mother, so here were some of the things that these mothers were typologized as: cold, perfectionistic, anxious, over-controlling, restrictive. And then another psychiatrist from Stanford, so these are very well respected, said it was a mother who was the prototype of the middle-class Anglo-Saxon American woman, prim, proper, but totally lacking in genuine affection. So here you're blaming that the mother doesn't love their children enough and show enough affection.
Right.
And then another researcher said the issue was mothers that put their children in a double bind. She tells them one thing, but communicates somehow that they should do the opposite, and then is disappointed when they don't. So the child just feels this disappointment from their mother. So, of course, there is absolutely no research base for any of this, but it was just the prevailing wisdom that mothers were the problem. Mimi was not a perfect mom. Yes, she was sometimes harsh with her children. She did have a kind of a perfectionistic streak. She wanted to have the perfect family. She wanted her children to really succeed. But of course, that extra burden of thinking that she was the cause of this, I really can't imagine. What did you think of Mimi?
I thought that she probably was perfectionistic, cold, anxious, over controlling.
Yeah.
I don't know that she was restrictive, but I do believe that she did the best that she could.
Right.
They were looking at the mom because the mom at that point was raising the children and the father was working.
Right.
What about the father? He's off on warships. When he is home, he's playing with some bird in the garage.
Falcons.
Can we look at him? And did not he serve in a war? And was not he in a hospital at one point?
Yeah.
Maybe with PTSD. We're not really sure, because obviously that was not even a classification. It wasn't even considered a disease. It wasn't in the DSM. So, and of course, what information did they have except for he had a breakdown? So he's just in the hospital. So why we're not looking at the men is because the men weren't home.
Mm-hmm.
All of this is rather complicated for researchers that are looking at this family. And what makes this family so strong for research is now we've got all this DNA stuff. Okay, they were all raised in the same home. We've got the same mama and dada. We're looking at the genetic stuff. We've got 6 siblings that don't have it, 6 siblings that do. Let's pull apart DNA and try to figure out what's going on. But there's only so much they can do with that too, because the experiences of the younger children growing up with these older kids, and these are young adults now with schizophrenia, their growing up is very different than the growing up of the oldest 3.
Yeah.
They're now in a traumatic situation. And the trauma that they experience as being the youngest siblings does create that they're growing up in a different environment. So it gets kind of complicated as you're doing research and you're really trying to weed out nature versus nurture with schizophrenia, I think. I did like Mimi. I appreciated the author just laying it out there as someone who had her own struggles and was trying to get these kids raised the best way she could, basically on her own.
Yeah.
What she was, which we didn't really talk about, was that she was a very strong advocate for her children to the very end.
Yes.
They had a home with her that shows that she did love these children. She went to all of these appointments and all of these doctors and just stayed wanting the best for these kids. And it sounded like not only did she have the oldest ones that she was trying to still parent with all of their appointments, she had the younger ones too. So you got this feeling like she was very, very busy and very devoted to the children.
Her boys were in and out of different institutions, and she was always there. She was always there checking in on them, checking in on their treatments, giving the providers information about what seemed to be working, what wasn't working. And that was really remarkable.
But she does sort of live in that denial state, it seems like, for a while.
Yeah.
Especially with the oldest one, who's very, very troubled. She's still expecting that he's going to get better. She loves him so much or has such high expectations that she doesn't really see that he's reaping havoc on the rest of the family.
Right.
He's sort of a golden boy.
He is in her eyes for sure. Even when he tries to murder his girlfriend, she completely sweeps that under the rug, and none of the other children even are aware of that.
Well, I think he tried to kill her too. I think his hands were around her throat at one point, and the younger brothers tore him away from her.
Yeah.
But she loves her son.
Yeah.
So what is she going to do? There weren't a lot of choices early on what you do.
Right.
There's the hospital or there's home.
Right. So let's talk about the 2 youngest children. And these were the 2 girls. They were living their lives with brothers with schizophrenia, some of whom were living at home, some were living outside the home, but they were certainly all interacting at different times. And these girls, to add to the trauma that they went through, they were also victims of ongoing sexual assault by one of the brothers who had schizophrenia. They also witnessed all the violence that we're talking about. And then they were the secondary victims of suicide and murder.
Yeah. And it seemed like the author got a lot of information about the family through these 2.
Yeah.
He obviously interviewed Mimi, 4 boys that didn't have schizophrenia. This priest had his hands on some of these boys. Needless to say, this was not a safe home for the children that were not diagnosed with schizophrenia yet and grew up in this chaotic home. And it wasn't a safe home for the children who did not have schizophrenia because they grew up in this chaos and trauma, and each of them had their own mental health issues they experienced growing up and they experienced as adults that led them to have their own struggles and have to overcome their own things.
And they each seem to do that in different ways. The 2 girls, Lindsay, the youngest of the 12 children, ends up becoming really the caregiver for her family. She's the caregiver for her mom in her final year or 2 of life. She becomes the caregiver for her 4 brothers with schizophrenia in terms of advocating for them and keeping on top of their appointments and making sure they're getting to where they need to be and checking in on them. The other sister, Margaret, who is the second youngest, She really has set her boundaries that she is not interested in that kind of close involvement. And she certainly isn't as interested in lots of family processing, where Lindsay, the youngest, talking this out is really important to her. She's the one who's been very involved in mental health therapy. Margaret, not at all. She mostly just wants to live her life. I thought it was interesting, too, how Colker talks about their relationship over the years. When they were young children, of course, the two of them, they're just trying to survive. And they
Sure.
really do not have much of a relationship with one another. Margaret ends up being sent to a very wealthy family and ends up being taken away from the family, separated, so they don't have a relationship. And then it's really in their 20s where the girls come together and they become incredibly close as they share that they both had been sexually abused by their brother. And they just are trying to figure out what that family experience was all about. And so they become very, very close. And really later then, as I'm talking about, as the youngest is taking care of the mom and the brothers, they kind of drift apart again, just with the different ways that they're continuing to deal with their family situation. I thought that was really important and also very realistic that, again, Colker doesn't gloss over any of this, but he seems to be reporting this as authentically as he can.
I agree. What I appreciated was that journey that each one of these folks took was very different. And I thought he was very transparent in that. I think it's easier for Margaret. You know, she was plucked up out of that family, not that she had any say to it, and she was removed.
Yeah.
So you think, okay, so she didn't have to go through the traumatic of her whole life being in that home, but being removed and sent away to people who live differently. You're in a different school. Her experience was that she didn't know that she fit in because she didn't have as much money or those experiences as her classmates did. And then as little Lindsay looks through the door at her sister being removed, she has her own set of, I'm stuck here and I'm really not safe because I'm the youngest. And how horrible for her, because now she doesn't even have a sister to go through this with. As her brother is having delusions and talking to himself, and her brothers are fighting each other. For her and her sister, kind of the safest way was outside the house with their brother who was sexually abusing them.
Yeah.
She didn't have a sister to go through that with, and she was the closest. And a lot of times she was home by herself with brothers that had their own issues, and she really wasn't safe.
Right.
She was just not safe in that home. It's a very sad situation for those two little girls, but the boys that were in that house as well, it wasn't a safe environment for them either.
No.
And you see that their personal struggles as they come into adulthood was that they weren't cared for either, like they should have been, and they weren't safe either.
Right.
Some of these boys were very violent, and that's when you get a picture of Mimi and her husband and why they're tolerating this in their home and how they handle the situation before any of them have a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Things are falling apart big time.
Yeah.
And that's when you go like, are they just in denial so much? Does Mimi and her husband think that this is just boy behavior? This is not boy behavior. This is behavior that, to me, reading about it through the eyes of this author, that things are falling apart way before the schizophrenia is even on the scene.
This isn't just roughhousing. This is smashing each other's skulls into the concrete.
It's chaos.
It's chaos, yeah.
The one girl has a feeling of being put through the smacking machine or something like that, but feeling a little creeped out as they're doing it and feeling like it had sort of a sexual overtone to it.
Yeah.
You look at the family dynamics there and they're not healthy.
Yeah.
Now, I know, Nancy, when I talked with you about a week before this podcast, you said you ran through this book in like 2 days.
Might have been 24 hours.
Okay. 24 hours you zipped on through this book. What was it that I guess you thought was so interesting that you had a hard time putting it down?
Well, I think it really was this combination of family experience and then the story of the research. And one of the people we haven't talked about yet is one of the researchers whose career we follow throughout this book. Her name is Linda Lisi. When we first meet her, she basically has to beg her way into a research lab at NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health. And she's a postdoc, but she's a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And most labs really aren't interested in having a woman because we all know she'll just get pregnant and leave the field.
Right.
She becomes really interested in studying families to figure out the physical as well as environmental factors that contribute to schizophrenia. So, throughout her career and all the naysayers, and as society evolves in terms of understanding that women can be good researchers, she collects the largest database of DNA samples from families with schizophrenia in the world. And part of this is the research that she's doing. You live through the highs and lows of her life, her dead ends, the funding that's pulled, not because it's not effective, but because there just isn't a large enough return on investment for commercial sales. Her data samples that are taken away from her because of sponsorship from another drug company, her work being ignored. And then we also live with her some very exciting times with promising findings. One of them being the identification of a mutation in a gene called SHANK2.
I know, isn't that funny?
Yeah, I thought that
We're
was
laughing
funny.
because Nancy's last name is Shank.
Exactly. This was very interesting. This gene encodes the proteins that help the brain synapses transmit signals and the neurons to then react quickly. And it turns out that mutations, not just the SHANK2, but all the SHANK genes, 1, 2, and 3, may be connected with a variety of mental illnesses. And our researcher, Linda Lisi, she's at the center of all of this research. And she continues to be a prominent researcher in schizophrenia.
Yeah, really interesting to learn about all of her work. She's not the only researcher that we get to learn about in the book.
Right.
He covers both sides, the people that are really into the genetics, but then there's the nurture side.
Right.
But that Shank gene and the information that researchers are learning about that sounds like those were significant breakthroughs in understanding where schizophrenia comes from.
Yeah.
So the good news are these biological markers, and trying to understand these Shank DNA components and all the advances in neurology and DNA can lead now to earlier detection and treatment. Obviously, meds have improved dramatically over the course of this time.
Yeah.
Then you've got the behavioral therapies. You have mental health counselors, therapists working with people. Because of this family and really Mimi, the DNA, them coming forth saying this is how it was for us.
We really end up in this book just cheering on the researchers and also the families because there's still so much that we have to learn about it, what causes it, how we could possibly even prevent it, which is what some of the researchers are talking about. Can we remediate this mutation before birth or at an early age? It's just fascinating.
Again, and I said it at the beginning, but I think it's really fascinating that this research continues on. And now they're looking at the grandchildren.
Right.
Of all of these 12 children. And the one mom is sort of hyper focused and hyper aware of like, oh, I'm seeing this in my child. What's going on with him? Oh, I need to get him. Oh, he's going to get occupational therapy. He's going to get speech therapy. He's going to. And then that boy goes growing up going, oh my goodness, am I okay? Like my mom is having this experience with me. That's not healthy for a child either.
Right.
So she has to take a step back. So even as the children, now they're parents and they're concerned, obviously, because this whole nature nurture thing is not set in stone yet. So as they're raising their children, they have different experiences as a parent raising them. And now they're the mom.
Mm-hmm. And then the very last chapter I thought was so beautiful. An undergraduate has now joined a very prestigious research lab on schizophrenia, one of the researchers we haven't talked about. And he has invited her to join the lab. All the other graduate students and postdocs are like, we don't let undergraduates in this lab. One of them makes a comment at some point, well, your family must have a lot of money that they've contributed to the lab. And it's one of the granddaughters. And she said, we didn't have money to contribute, but we contributed to this lab.
Right.
And she is now going into schizophrenia research.
Yeah. Fantastic end to the book, isn't it?
Really is.
Well, this was such a good book. We do cheer on the little researcher now, this young lady who's getting into it, and the research continues on. But we're so excited. We're going to have the author join us next time, and so excited to be talking to him about this.
For the city of Lincoln, Nebraska. This was our One Book, One Lincoln selection this year. So we've been having conversations about this book over the year. So I'll be interested to also talk to him about his experience as an author who was selected for that.
Oh, interesting. I've forgotten about that, Nancy. So that'll be really interesting to hear his take on it. He will be the second Wednesday of August.
It will be the third Wednesday of August.
Oh, it will be the third Wednesday of August. Well, we're so excited to have him.
Our website is frontporchbookclub.com.
And our episodes come out twice a month, the first and the third Wednesdays of each month.
Really fascinating book. And I really encourage anyone with any interest in family dynamics, mental health, schizophrenia particularly, to pick this book up. It is well worth your time reading it.
Yep. 5 stars out of 5 stars.
Yep.
Don't say that. All right, Nancy. Well, I will see you next time when we talk to this author.
Great.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.